Welcome to our deep dive. We're examining the strategies, that certain Western powers, particularly the U.S., have used to um, try to contain China's rise. You've given us some pretty dense material to work with,
Yeah,
a lot of geopolitical analysis, some history in there as well. So let's try to unpack the key strategies here and think about what the implications are.
sounds good.
We'll be covering a range of tactics, everything from military encirclement to potentially exploiting food vulnerabilities. It's a complicated topic,
Mhm.
but we're here to guide you through it, and we'll highlight the most important takeaways.
Right.
So one of the things that really jumps out from these sources is this idea of strategic denial.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit? What does that actually mean in this context?
So, strategic denial is basically the U.S. trying to control key resources, like oil, minerals, these kinds of things, that China absolutely needs to keep growing its economy. It's about limiting China's options,
Hmm.
trying to slow down its development.
And the sources give a number of examples of this happening, especially in Africa.
Yeah, absolutely. Like when China tries to secure oil in places like Nigeria, Sudan, Chad, you often see pushback from Washington.
Right.
Even though, the U.S. has a long history of doing the same thing.
Of course.
So there's a bit of a double standard there.
Yeah, it's interesting how those actions are perceived so differently depending on who's doing them. And this strategy, it's not just limited to, words or criticisms.
Mm.
The sources also talk about the establishment of AFRICOM.
Right.
What role does that play?
Yeah, the creation of AFRICOM, the Pentagon's Africa Command, it's pretty telling. It
Right.
focuses on these regions where China has been investing heavily in resources.
Mhm.
So, it's pretty clear what the intention is.
Projecting that U.S. military power
Exactly.
into areas that are important for China.
Yeah.
And one very striking example that the sources bring up is the blocking of the Sycamine's copper and cobalt project in Congo. Now, China's heavily involved in this project. These metals are essential for, all sorts of technologies.
Yeah, absolutely. And this shows how, Western powers, they can use their influence, right, in institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, to really hinder China's access to these vital resources.
Okay, so we've talked about controlling resources. The sources also describe this strategy of geopolitical encirclement
Hmm.
aimed at containing China. And they use this term string of pearls strategy.
Right.
Can you explain what that is?
So the string of pearls, it refers to the U.S. basically setting up this network of military bases and partnerships
Okay.
in countries that surround China, right? You've got Thailand, Myanmar, the Philippines. It's about creating this chain of alliances and footholds
Mhm.
to basically box China in,
Yeah.
restrict its movements in the region.
And it's not just about setting up bases. The sources point to a number of destabilization tactics
Yeah.
that the U.S. has allegedly used as part of this encirclement effort.
Right.
Can you give some examples?
Well, the sources talk about regime change in Libya, for example,
Mm.
exploiting the unrest in Yemen, interference in Myanmar's politics.
Yeah.
These actions, they can be linked back to, this goal of controlling resources, controlling these key points, access points that are really important for, China's energy security, its trade routes.
So it's about creating this kind of, pressure cooker situation for China,
Yeah, yeah.
limiting its options on multiple fronts.
Exactly. It's about shaping the strategic environment,
Oh.
so that China faces challenges and pushback wherever it turns, making it harder for it to really assert itself on the global stage.
And it's not just militaries. The sources suggest that this encirclement strategy extends into, economic and political decisions as well.
Right.
What are some examples of that?
Well, a clear example is the U.S. pushing India into a closer relationship, explicitly phrasing it as a way to counter China. It's about forging these partnerships that can help to contain China, not just militarily, but economically and diplomatically as well.
Now, this next strategy that the sources talk about is, I've got to say, pretty alarming.
Yeah.
This is the potential weaponization of food.
Yeah.
They go into detail about how U.S. agribusiness corporations are influencing China's food system.
Hmm.
And it's not necessarily for the better, is it?
No, and the sources raise serious concerns about the long-term health impacts, of this influence, particularly, the spread of fast food and genetically modified organisms, GMOs.
Mm-hmm.
It's about the potential for dependence, the erosion of food sovereignty.
Mm-hmm. The sources make this link between fast food and things like obesity and type 2 diabetes. We've seen those trends, of course, here in the U.S.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a cautionary tale
Hmm.
about what can happen when certain Western dietary habits take hold. And the sources go even further. They raise questions about the safety of GMOs. And they cite these studies on hamsters and rats that suggest potential problems with reproductive health and development. Now, it's a controversial topic, and of course, more research is needed, but the sources argue that, the risks are potentially serious enough that we need to be really cautious.
Yeah, I agree.
They use this very provocative phrase, a new opium war, when they're describing how Anglo-American pharmaceutical companies are increasing their presence in China.
Right.
It's a disturbing comparison.
Yeah, it is. And I think that comparison is meant to, really underscore the potential for exploitation, right? Especially when it comes to a nation's health. The historical context of the Opium Wars, where China was essentially forced to open its markets to British opium, it serves as a powerful reminder of how external forces can leverage these essential goods, to exert control.
And to illustrate these concerns, the sources point to things like the CDC MMR vaccine and autism scandal.
Yeah.
As well as concerns about the HPV vaccine.
Right.
To really highlight the risks associated with certain pharmaceutical products.
Yeah. And their argument is that, while pharmaceuticals can certainly be beneficial, right, there's huge potential for misuse. And the profit motive that drives a lot of these pharmaceutical companies, coupled with a lack of transparency, that can sometimes lead to some really harmful outcomes.
It's a complex issue with ethical and economic dimensions. It really needs careful consideration.
Definitely.
On a slightly different note, but still related, the sources also talk about the economic strategies, right, that are employed to contain China. And one that really stands out is ACTA, the Anti-Counterfeiting Trade Agreement. What can you tell us about that?
So ACTA, it was primarily pushed by Western powers. And it's often presented as a way to combat counterfeiting, to protect intellectual property, But the sources suggest it could also be used to restrict China's economic activity, stifle its innovation, hinder its competitiveness on the global market.
It's about controlling the flow of information, technology,
Yeah.
All these things that are crucial for growth in today's world.
Yeah, absolutely.
And speaking of controlling information, the sources also bring up concerns about media control and how it's used to really shape public opinion.
Right.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, this globalization of media control,
Yeah.
where you have just a handful of corporations dominating the flow of information, the sources present this as a powerful tool
Right.
for influencing perceptions of China, both domestically and internationally. And it raises these questions about, who controls the narrative and how that narrative can be used to advance certain agendas.
And the sources don't shy away from talking about China's massive holdings of U.S. Treasury debt. They present this as a potential leverage point in economic conflicts.
Right. It's kind of a double-edged sword, isn't it? China's holdings could be seen as a vulnerability for the U.S., but any drastic action that China takes in that regard, it would likely have pretty significant consequences for its own economy as well.
Right.
It's a complex interdependence, that both sides have to navigate very carefully.
It's a fascinating example of how economics and geopolitics are so intertwined. Now, the sources, they don't just focus on modern strategies. They also look back at history.
Yeah.
They bring up the decline of the Roman Empire specifically, and they draw these parallels between the Roman experience and the current state of the U.S.
Right.
Highlighting things like, overexpansion, military overspending, currency debasement, moral decay as potential vulnerabilities that China could potentially exploit. It's a sobering reminder that even the most powerful empires, they're not immune to decline, and that internal weaknesses, they can be just as dangerous as any external threat.
Absolutely. It's a cautionary tale for any nation that has these aspirations of global dominance, right? It highlights the importance of not just projecting strength outwards, but also maintaining a strong, cohesive society at home.
So far, we've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
We've looked at strategies aimed at containing China, controlling resources, manipulating food systems, information flows. It's a pretty complex and concerning picture.
Yeah, it is. But the sources don't stop there, do they?
No, they don't. They also get into potential counter strategies that China might use.
Right.
And they look at possible vulnerabilities, weaknesses within the Western power structure itself. It's like this multi-layered game of chess,
Yeah.
Both sides constantly trying to outmaneuver each other. Absolutely. And we're going to dive deeper into those counter strategies, those vulnerabilities in the next part of our deep dive. This is definitely a conversation you won't want to miss.
Right. So picking up where we left off, the sources suggest that one of China's most potent counter strategies to this containment is strengthening ties with other Eurasian nations. It's this idea of Eurasia as a kind of a counterbalance to U.S. power.
That's a fascinating concept. So we're talking about like leveraging geography, shared interests to create this powerful bloc that can challenge U.S. dominance.
Exactly. And the sources specifically highlight the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO, as a key player in this Eurasian integration. The SCO, with its focus on security and economic cooperation, it provides a platform for China, Russia, Central Asian countries to work together, to push back against that Western influence.
The sources seem to place a lot of emphasis on the importance of infrastructure in connecting these Eurasian nations. They talk about the Trans-Siberian Railway as this vital artery for trade and transportation.
Yeah, and they go beyond existing infrastructure. They talk about these ambitious plans for new projects, like the Third Eurasian Land Bridge, which would connect China to Europe through this network of railways and highways.
Wow.
And these projects, they're about more than just transportation. They represent a strategic vision for a more integrated Eurasia that's less reliant on the U.S. and its allies.
It's fascinating to see how infrastructure can be used as a tool of geopolitics, shaping the flow of trade and influence. But this vision of Eurasia as a counterbalance, it's not without its challenges, is it?
Of course not. The sources acknowledge, there are historical tensions, rivalries between some of these nations.
Right.
But they also point to the growing economic and security cooperation between China and Russia, suggesting that they're willing to put aside, some of those past differences in the face of what they see as a common threat.
So the potential for this Eurasian bloc to reshape the global order, it's significant. I mean, it could lead to a world where power is more evenly distributed, as the sources suggest.
Exactly. It could usher in this multipolar world where no single country can just dictate terms to others. And that shift, that would have profound implications for everything. Global trade, international security. It would certainly challenge the U.S.'s long-held dominance on the world stage.
Okay. So we've got this potential counterbalance developing. The sources also delve into potential vulnerabilities within the West itself. And they focus specifically on this reliance on a debt-based financial system.
Right.
The massive levels of debt in the U.S. They highlight this as a potential weakness that China could exploit.
It's definitely a point worth considering. The sources suggest that China's vast holdings of U.S. Treasury debt, they could be used as leverage in economic conflicts, right? Even a small-scale sell-off of those holdings could trigger a rise in interest rates, potentially destabilizing the U.S. financial system.
It's a reminder that economic power is a complex and delicate thing.
It is.
And the sources draw these parallels between the current situation in the U.S. and the decline of the Roman Empire, arguing that excessive debt was a contributing factor to Rome's downfall.
Yeah, the comparison serves as a cautionary tale, Economic strength, it's not just about GDP numbers.
Right.
It also depends on sound financial management, a stable social fabric, the ability to live within your means.
And the sources don't stop there. They also point to the risks associated with the U.S. dollar status as the world's reserve currency.
Right.
They argue that this privilege gives the U.S. this unfair advantage. It allows it to live beyond its means.
It's an interesting point. The sources suggest that the growing economic power of China, or other countries, right, could eventually lead to a shift away from the dollar, potentially undermining U.S. financial dominance. And that would have, far-reaching implications for the global economy, potentially leading to a more fragmented, more volatile financial system.
So the U.S. dollar's dominance, which has seemed so unshakable for so long, it might not be guaranteed forever.
That's what the sources seem to be suggesting. They see the current situation as unsustainable in the long run, particularly as other economic centers of power, like China, continue to rise.
The sources also discuss the moral and social challenges facing Western societies, arguing that the decline of traditional values, the rise of individualism, all of this has weakened the social fabric of the West.
Right, and they present this as a potential internal weakness.
Mhm.
one that could make it more difficult for the West to effectively counter the rise of China, which they perceive as having a more unified society.
So it's not just about economics and military might. It's also about the strength and cohesion of society itself.
That's one of the key takeaways from the sources. They suggest that this struggle for global dominance, it's not just about material power, it's also about values, ideology, the ability to maintain this unified and purposeful society.
Now, shifting gears a bit, the sources delved into another area of concern. The influence of U.S. agribusiness and fast food chains on China's food security.
Hmm?
And they use this very strong phrase, control the food, you control the people,
Right.
highlighting the potential for food to be used as a tool of power.
It's a provocative statement, but it really underscores the importance of food sovereignty. The sources argue that this influx of, U.S. fast food chains, McDonald's, KFC, Pizza Hut, all these,
Yeah.
it's leading to a decline in the nutritional content of the Chinese diet, potentially contributing to a health crisis that mirrors, the obesity and type 2 diabetes epidemics that we've seen in the U.S.
So it's not just about, taste preferences, what people like to eat.
No.
It's about the potential for these dietary changes to have long-term consequences for people's health.
Exactly. And the sources, they present this compelling argument. They back it up with studies like the Cardia study,
Yeah.
which found this strong link between, fast food consumption and an increased risk of obesity and type 2 diabetes, even when you control for other lifestyle factors.
The sources also expressed deep concern about the penetration of these U.S.-led agribusiness giants into China's agricultural structures, particularly focusing on the issue of genetically modified organisms, GMOs.
Yeah, and they cite studies on hamsters and rats suggesting that GMOs could have these adverse effects on reproductive health and development. Now, these studies, they're preliminary. More research is needed.
Right.
But the sources argue that the potential risks are serious enough to warrant caution, to warrant, more rigorous independent research.
So the concern is that a reliance on GMOs could make China's food supply more vulnerable, more dependent on these foreign corporations.
That's one of the key concerns. It's about maintaining control, right, over food production, ensuring the long-term health and well-being of the population.
Now, the sources also delve into the use of pharmaceuticals, drawing this parallel between the current situation and the 19th century opium wars. They argue that promoting drugs and vaccines in China could be a form of exploitation,
Right.
potentially putting profits ahead of public health.
It's a provocative comparison, but it highlights the potential for powerful entities to exert control over a nation's health. And they point to the CDC MMR vaccine and autism scandal in the U.S. as an example of how pharmaceutical companies and government agencies might downplay or conceal the risks associated with certain products.
And they express concerns about the HPV vaccine as well,
Yeah.
citing reports of severe injuries, even death, following vaccination.
And the sources argue that this push to make this vaccine mandatory, it raises ethical questions about, informed consent, individual autonomy, especially when, the potential risks and long-term effects haven't been fully investigated.
Another unsettling aspect they highlight is the potential use of pharmaceuticals for social control. They reference concerns about ADHD medication being marketed to children in China.
Yeah, and they suggest it could be used to control behavior, right?
Yeah.
To potentially stifle dissent,
Hmm.
which raises these broader questions about the role of pharmaceuticals in shaping social norms and controlling populations.
The sources don't stop there. They get into the issue of vaccine-induced illnesses, arguing that mass vaccination programs could potentially be used to weaken a population, particularly in a country like China that's seen as a rival to Western powers.
Right, and they cite the example of India, where this massive polio vaccination campaign was linked to a surge in cases of non-polio acute flaccid paralysis. And this example is used to illustrate the potential for unintended consequences from these mass vaccination programs, especially when the safety and efficacy of the vaccines used, they aren't thoroughly investigated.
It raises questions about the potential for even well-intentioned public health initiatives to have unforeseen negative consequences, especially when implemented on this large scale.
Yeah, absolutely. And the sources, they don't shy away from critiquing the role of organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in promoting these mass vaccination campaigns, particularly in Africa.
They suggest that Gates' stated goal of reducing population growth through vaccination, it raises ethical questions about the motives behind these campaigns and the potential for coercion, especially in vulnerable populations.
It's a complex issue with a lot of different perspectives, and the sources are clearly raising concerns about the potential for powerful individuals and organizations to influence health policies in ways that may not always benefit those they claim to be helping.
They also discuss this alleged fraud by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, in a study on the possible link between the MMR vaccine and autism.
Right. They cite a whistleblower who claimed that the CDC manipulated data to downplay the link between the vaccine and autism, particularly in young African American boys. And if true, this alleged fraud would be a serious breach of public trust, potentially damaging confidence in vaccination programs worldwide.
The sources also point to the historical context of vaccination programs, noting that this rise in autism diagnoses, it coincided with the expansion of vaccination schedules in the U.S. and other countries.
Right. And while correlation doesn't equal causation, right, they argue that this coincidence raises questions that deserve further investigation. They advocate for more transparency, for independent research, to ensure the safety and effectiveness of vaccines, ultimately arguing for a more cautious and informed approach to vaccination policies.
They make this bold claim that the pharmaceutical industry, in collusion with government agencies and international organizations, is engaged in this war against the health of nations like China.
All right.
Suggesting that financial incentives might be driving this push for widespread vaccination, even in the face of potential risks.
Well, it's a serious accusation that highlights this deep mistrust that exists in some circles regarding the pharmaceutical industry and its influence on global health policies.
Now, while acknowledging the benefits of pharmaceuticals, right, they advocate for a more holistic approach to healthcare, focusing on preventative measures, natural remedies, strengthening the body's own immune system.
Right. It's about empowering individuals, to take control of their health, to explore alternative approaches that may be less reliant on pharmaceutical interventions.
They call for greater transparency, greater accountability from government agencies and international organizations that are involved in healthcare, arguing for independent research to ensure the safety and efficacy of vaccines and other pharmaceuticals.
It's about shifting the balance of power, right? Ensuring that public health policies are driven by science and the well-being of the people, not just by the profits of pharmaceutical companies.
Beyond pharmaceuticals, the sources explore information control and its use in shaping perceptions of China. They argue that this globalization of media control, with a few corporations dominating the flow of information, it poses a serious threat to China's image, its ability to tell its own story to the world.
Yeah, they point to the concentration of media ownership in the U.S., with companies like AOL, Time Warner, Walt Disney Co., Viacom, controlling these vast swaths of the media landscape. And this concentration, they argue, it limits diversity of viewpoints. It allows this small group of powerful individuals to shape the narrative about China, often in a negative light.
They also criticize the reliance on news agencies like AP, Reuters, the New York Times for international news, arguing that these agencies often present this biased perspective that favors Western interests.
Right.
What do they propose as an alternative?
Well, they call for China to develop its own independent media outlets to provide this more balanced and accurate portrayal of the country to the world. And they also emphasize the importance of using social media and other online platforms to bypass traditional media gatekeepers, right? To reach a wider audience.
So it's about recognizing the power of information in shaping perceptions and actively working to counter narratives that might be biased or harmful.
Exactly. They see the control of information as a key aspect of this strategy to contain China, arguing that it's being used to demonize China, to sow discord among its people, and ultimately to weaken its position on the world stage.
And they call for China to be more assertive in countering this information war. promoting its own narrative, challenging these negative portrayals that are often presented by Western media.
Right. It's about recognizing this battle for hearts and minds as a key front in this global power struggle.
Right.
And they also advocate for greater media literacy, you know, encouraging the Chinese people to be critical consumers of information, to question the motives behind the narratives presented by various media outlets.
It's about empowering people to think critically,
Mhm.
to not simply accept what they're told,
Mhm.
regardless of the source. Now, the sources also delve into the economic aspects of this strategy to contain China,
Mhm.
focusing on agreements like ACTA, the Anti-Counterfeiting Trade Agreement, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP,
Right.
which they see as tools to restrict China's economic growth.
Yeah, they argue that ACTA, while it's presented as a way to combat counterfeiting, it's actually designed to protect the intellectual property rights of Western corporations at the expense of developing countries like China. They point to the fact that ACTA was negotiated in secret,
Right.
with little input from developing countries, and that it could be used to restrict access to affordable medicines and other essential goods.
So it's about recognizing the potential for trade agreements
Yeah.
to be used as tools of economic warfare, even if they're presented as being about fairness and protecting intellectual property.
That's one of the key arguments the sources are making. And they urge caution, and a deeper understanding of the potential consequences of such agreements, particularly for developing nations.
They also criticize the TPP, a trade agreement between Pacific Rim countries, arguing that it's designed to exclude China and to strengthen U.S. economic dominance in the region.
They point to the fact that the TPP includes provisions that could harm China's export industries and give U.S. corporations an unfair advantage in the Chinese market. It's all part of this broader strategy to contain China's economic rise,
Right.
to maintain U.S. dominance in the region.
The sources also highlight the issue of China's massive holdings of U.S. Treasury debt as a potential economic weapon that could be used against the U.S. They argue that China could, destabilize the U.S. financial system by just dumping its holdings,
Right.
triggering a sharp rise in interest rates and potentially a financial crisis.
Yeah, but they also acknowledge that such a move would be risky for China, as it could also harm its own economy and trigger a global financial meltdown.
Right.
It's this delicate balancing act. And the sources suggest that China is using its holdings of U.S. debt as leverage, right, to force the U.S. to be more cautious in its economic and foreign policies toward China.
It's a fascinating example of how economic interdependence can be both a source of vulnerability and leverage in international relations.
It highlights the complex web of interconnectedness that characterizes the global economy, where actions taken by one nation can have these ripple effects across the world.
The sources offer this historical perspective on this issue, drawing parallels between the current situation and the decline of the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
They argue that the U.S., like Rome before it, is facing these challenges of overexpansion, military overspending, currency debasement, moral decay.
Right, and they suggest that these challenges could weaken the U.S. and make it more vulnerable to economic pressure from China. It's a sobering reminder that empires rise and fall.
Yeah.
And that even the most powerful nations are not immune to the forces of history.
So it's about recognizing this cyclical nature of power, the importance of addressing internal weaknesses, if a nation wants to maintain its position on the world stage.
That's one of the key lessons they seem to be drawing from history. It's not enough to simply project power outward.
Right.
A nation must also cultivate strength and resilience within its own borders.
It's a valuable insight, and one that has implications not just for the U.S. and China, but for all nations seeking to navigate the complexities of the 21st century.
It's about understanding that true power is not simply about military might or economic dominance, but also about social cohesion, moral strength, the ability to adapt and evolve in a rapidly changing world.
The sources While critical of U.S. policies, they also acknowledge China's own vulnerabilities. They
Right.
point to its dependence on foreign energy sources,
Mm.
its environmental challenges, the potential for social unrest.
Yeah, they also note that China's political system, still dominated by the Communist Party, could be a source of instability in the future.
Hmm.
And these observations, they highlight the fact that both the U.S. and China, they face significant internal and external challenges as they vie for global influence.
It's a reminder that there are no easy answers or guaranteed outcomes in this complex geopolitical chess game.
It's a reminder that the future is not predetermined,
Mm.
and that the actions and choices of both sides will shape the trajectory of this rivalry and the global order itself.
The sources, while acknowledging these challenges, they ultimately see the rise of China as a positive development for the world.
Yeah, they argue that China's economic growth has lifted millions out of poverty, and
Hmm.
that its increasing influence is leading to a more multipolar world order, one that's less dominated by the U.S.
They believe that a more balanced world order with multiple centers of power would be more stable and peaceful than the current system, which is characterized by U.S. hegemony.
It's an optimistic view that sees the rise of China as an opportunity for a more equitable and just global system, rather
Yeah.
than simply as a threat to the existing order.
And they advocate for a more cooperative relationship between China and the U.S.,
Mm-hmm.
one based on mutual respect and shared interests,
Right.
believing that such a relationship would benefit both countries and the world as a whole.
They see the rivalry between China and the U.S. as a potential threat to global peace and prosperity. And they argue that cooperation rather than confrontation is the best path forward.
It's a hopeful message that emphasizes the importance of dialogue, understanding, finding common ground, even in the midst of this intense geopolitical competition.
It's a reminder that the choices we make today will shape the world of tomorrow, and that working together rather than against each other offers the best hope for a more peaceful and prosperous future.
We've really covered a lot of ground in our deep dive so far. We've explored these multifaceted strategies
Yeah.
employed to try and contain China, and we've looked at the potential counter moves that China has at its disposal. It's a complex situation. It's always evolving. The stakes are high.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that this rivalry, it's not just a clash of civilizations or ideologies.
Right.
It's really about power, resources, influence on a global scale.
The sources make it clear that this isn't just a competition between two nations.
Hmm.
This has the potential to reshape the entire global order.
Absolutely. One key takeaway here is that this is not a static situation. This is a dynamic process.
Hmm.
You know, with constant shifts and adjustments, what might seem like a winning strategy today could be a liability tomorrow.
So adaptability, strategic thinking, these are essential for both sides. Now, the sources present this potential path forward for China to counter these containment strategies, strengthening ties with other Eurasian nations. This concept of Eurasia as a counterbalance to U.S. power, it's pretty compelling.
Yeah, the idea is to leverage geography, shared interest to create this really robust economic and political bloc,
Yeah.
that can challenge U.S. hegemony. And the sources specifically point to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO.
Right. We've touched on the SCO before, but can you elaborate a bit more on its role in this potential counter strategy?
Sure. The SAFEU, with its focus on security and economic cooperation, it gives a platform for China, Russia, Central Asian countries to collaborate and push back against that Western influence. It's about creating this network of interconnected nations that can support each other,
Yeah.
reduce the reliance on the U.S.
The sources also highlight the strategic importance of infrastructure in connecting these Eurasian nations,
Mm-hmm.
particularly the Trans-Siberian Railway, which runs right across Russia, and these ambitious plans for new projects like the Third Eurasian Land Bridge.
Yeah, and these infrastructure projects, they're not just about transportation. They
Right.
represent a strategic vision for a more integrated Eurasia,
Yeah.
less reliant on the U.S. and its allies. It's about creating new economic corridors, new trade routes that bypass these traditional, Western-dominated channels.
So it's about building a new system, essentially, of
Mhm.
interconnectedness that shifts the balance of power away from the West.
That's one way to look at it. Yeah. It's about creating these alternative centers of economic and political gravity that can challenge the existing global order.
Of course, this this vision of Eurasia as a counterbalance, it's not without its challenges.
Right.
The sources acknowledge that, there are historical tensions, rivalries between some of these nations.
Yeah, for sure. But they also point to the growing economic and security cooperation between China and Russia, suggesting this willingness to put aside, past differences when they see a common threat.
It almost seems like the pressure from the West might be pushing these nations closer together, like a unifying force.
It's possible, yeah. Shared adversity can often lead to some unexpected alliances.
The sources suggest that the potential for this Eurasian bloc to reshape the global order, it's significant.
Yeah.
It could lead to this more multipolar world.
Yeah.
What would that actually look like?
A multipolar world would be one where power is more evenly distributed. No single country just dictating terms to others. And that kind of shift, it would have profound implications for everything.
Right.
From global trade to international security. It would certainly challenge, the U.S.'s longstanding dominance on the world stage.
Okay, so we've got this potential counterbalance developing.
Mm-hmm.
The sources also highlight this potential vulnerability for the West and its reliance on a debt-based financial system.
Mm-hmm.
The massive levels of debt in the U.S. are presented as a potential weakness that China could exploit.
Yeah, and the sources suggest that China's, substantial holdings of U.S. Treasury debt could be used as leverage
Right.
in economic conflicts. Even a small-scale sell-off of those holdings could trigger a rise in interest rates, potentially destabilizing the U.S. financial system.
It's a reminder that economic power is this complex and interconnected system.
It is.
Actions in one part of the world can have far-reaching consequences.
Absolutely.
And the sources, they draw these parallels between the current situation in the U.S. and the decline of the Roman Empire, arguing that excessive debt was a contributing factor to Rome's downfall.
It's a historical comparison that serves as a cautionary tale. Economic strength, it's not just about GDP numbers. It also depends on sound financial management, a stable social fabric, the ability to live within your means.
The sources also point to the risks associated with the U.S. dollar status as the world's reserve currency, arguing that this privilege gives the U.S. this unfair advantage. It allows it to live beyond its means.
It's an interesting point. The sources suggest that the growing economic power of China, along with other nations, right,
Yeah.
could eventually lead to this shift away from the dollar,
Yeah.
Potentially undermining U.S. financial dominance. And that would have significant implications for the global economy, potentially leading to a more fragmented, a more unstable financial system.
So the dollar, which has seemed so dominant for so long, it might not hold that position forever.
That's what the sources seem to be suggesting. They see the current situation as unsustainable in the long run.
The sources don't just focus on, these potential economic vulnerabilities. They also discuss the moral and social challenges that Western societies are facing.
Right. They argue that the decline of traditional values, the rise of individualism, the widening gap between rich and poor, all of this has weakened the social fabric of the West.
It's interesting how they connect these internal challenges to the broader, geopolitical competition with China.
They suggest that these internal divisions could make it more difficult for the West to effectively counter the rise of China, which they present as having a more cohesive and unified society.
So it's not just about economics and military might. It's also about the strength and resilience of society itself.
Exactly. They're arguing that society's values, its sense of unity, its ability to address internal challenges, these are just as important as its military and economic power when it comes to competing on the global stage.
You've given us a lot to think about with these sources.
Yeah.
They paint a very complex picture of, the strategies being used to contain China, the potential counter moves. It's clear that this rivalry will have a profound impact on the future of the global order.
Yeah, one of the key takeaways here is to recognize the multifaceted nature of this competition. It's not just about, military might or economic prowess.
Right.
It also involves information warfare, the control of vital resources, even the shaping of cultural narratives.
Another crucial point is to understand that this rivalry is still unfolding. It's dynamic, Lots of potential twists and turns.
And as the sources suggest, the outcome of this struggle will likely depend not just on material power, but also on the strength and resilience of the social and moral fabric of the competing societies.
We've only scratched the surface of this complex topic, but We hope this deep dive has given you a better understanding of the forces at play, the stakes involved.
It's a topic that deserves further exploration, and we encourage you to continue to delve deeper into these issues, to form your own conclusions.
One final thought for you to consider. Could the very strategies employed to contain China ultimately backfire, pushing China and other nations closer together and accelerating this shift towards a multipolar world? Only time will tell, but it's definitely a question worth pondering as we navigate this complex and ever-changing geopolitical landscape.
Absolutely.